Now we're going to reach the exciting conclusion to how the slave-owning Francis Scott Key killed the abolitionist Dr. Reuben Crandall. Dr. Reuben Crandall will be killed by the end of this third part. But first, let's go to John Arthur Bowen's trial. So, John Arthur Bowen's trial, he is put on trial with the charges of attempted murder and burglary, and his trial began first in late November 1835. So, Dr. Reuben Crandall has been in jail for months. So, first we're trying John Arthur Bowen. Anna Maria Brodue Thornton testified that John Arthur Bowen had been a docile boy, perhaps spoiled, who had succumbed to drink as he got older. And she said that she did not believe that he had intended to kill her. So, wait a second. Spoiled? He's a slave, right? So how could he be spoiled? How could he be spoiled if he's a slave? Anna Maria Brodue Thornton said that John Arthur Bowen was spoiled because he refused to take any orders from any women. Well, first of all, Anna Maria Brodue Thornton should have not had any slaves to begin with. She shouldn't have had any slaves to begin with because, first of all, it's just wrong, right, to violently oppress somebody else, but more importantly because William Thornton's will stated that he wanted his slaves freed. But Anna Maria Brodue Thornton and her mother want to keep their property for free labor. They liked that free labor. They got spoiled off that free labor. Had Anna Maria Brodue Thornton had honored William Thornton's wishes, John Arthur Bowen would have never been caught up in any of this mess. It wasn't that John Arthur Bowen was spoiled, it was that Anna Maria Brodue Thornton was spoiled. And she had been illegally holding slaves, even by the standards of her own time. But she got away with her crimes. But Anna Maria Thornton calling John Arthur Bowen, a young man who had been enslaved his entire life, spoiled, that's fucked up. In fact, that's what Henry Clay would say about one of his slaves, too. And George Washington, too. It seems like all these slave owners seem to be, getting mad about their spoiled slaves because the ones that they treated nice were the ones that were rebelling the most. And, it reminds me of the Frederick Douglass's master. He had said, if you give them an inch, they'll take it a mile. So, a house servant of Henry Clay's, a mulatto boy, had ran away from Henry Clay's violently oppressive wife, and Henry Clay offered a $50 reward for his capture, and he made a remark that betrayed his true feelings about kindness to slaves. Henry Clay said, "We have spoiled him by good treatment." Spoiled him by good treatment. If he was so damn spoiled by all that good treatment, Henry Clay, then why in the hell is he running away? Henry Clay owned up to 60 slaves at one point, and he was sued by an ex-slave, Charlotte Dupay, in 1829. Eventually, Henry Clay would put Charlotte Dupay in her place by dragging her back, kicking and screaming, back into the slave life that she had hated. One of Henry Clay's slaves told about the heinous treatment Henry Clay executed against his slaves. The slave had escaped to Canada, and said that Henry Clay once had him stripped and whipped with 150 lashes on his naked back for a trifling offense. Does that sound like somebody that's spoiling his slaves to you? George Washington called one of his runaway slaves spoiled too. Her name was Oni Judge Staines. And Oni Judge Staines would escape to freedom in 1796, and she lived her life as a fugitive slave in New Hampshire for the rest of her life. Why a fugitive slave? Well, guess what act George Washington passed? The Fugitive Slave Act. So if you run into a free state, that's still the property of the South, or of the slave owner. So eventually, they would ask her, they asked why she left, especially since she was one of George Washington's spoiled house Negroes. And Oni Judge Staines had told Joseph Whipple in 1796 that she told him that she wanted a thirst for complete freedom. Complete freedom. That's what Oni Judge Staines wanted. Complete freedom. That's what Charlotte Dupay wanted. Complete freedom. And that's what John Arthur Bowen had wanted too. Complete freedom. But Anna Maria Brodeur didn't want to feel any guilt about John Arthur Bowen getting lynched by the court system, so she defended him and said that he didn't intend on hurting anybody. Her neighbor, Henry Hunt, however, told a different story. Hunt was roused in the night by Anna Maria Brodeur Thornton, and Hunt said that Anna had said that Arthur had come into the room with an upraised axe. Hunt described Arthur shouting abolitionist slogans while slamming his axe into the door and calling for blood. On December 10, 1835, John Arthur Bowen appeared in court to hear the verdict. The jury deliberated for only 15 minutes before returning a guilty verdict, which meant that John Arthur Bowen was to be hanged by the neck until he be dead. Later on, Anna Maria Brodeur Thornton pleaded to President Andrew Johnson to spare John Arthur Bowen's life. The bloody execution of the court sentence, she told the president, would be more horrible than the offense. She explained that John Arthur Bowen was just a boy, even though he was 18 years old at the time, and that he was drunk on the demon rum, and that he never raised the axe. Anna Maria suggested mob passions had driven Francis Scott Key's prosecution. The recent alarms and agitations, meaning the Snow White race riot of 1835, may have had an unconscious influence in determining the expediency of seizing the first occasion to make a severe and terrifying example, she wrote in the letter, which is now located in the National Archives in College Park. Eventually, Andrew Jackson grants Arthur a stay, meaning that hanging would happen later, and then Andrew Jackson would issue another stay, and then ultimately Andrew Jackson would give John Arthur Bowen a full presidential pardon. So this turns out okay. He doesn't get killed, at least, right? We spared our consciences of him being murdered, even though he was in prison up until July 4th, 1836. And that's when John Arthur Bowen would be freed. So it was symbolic. July 4th, 1836, John Arthur Bowen got to be freed out of prison. Now, Anna Maria Brodeur Thornton attended to the necessary final details to secure John Arthur Bowen's safety. In return for the pardon, Anna Maria Brodeur Thornton agreed to sell John Arthur Bowen to John Henry Eaton, a friend of the president who promised to get Arthur training to become a servant on a steamship or a flatboat in Florida. Even though Anna Maria Brodeur Thornton wanted to be paid $800 for Arthur's life and labor, she reluctantly settled for $750. I never intended to sell him for life, but could not now avoid and hope and pray that he may lead a new life and be happy, wrote Anna Maria Brodeur Thornton in her diary. A few days later, John Arthur Bowen left Washington, D.C. and embarked on his future in the land of the free and home of the brave as a slave to John Henry Eaton on his steamship or his flatboat in Florida. Now, for the trial of the century, the United States of America versus Dr. Reuben Crandall. Old Frank Key didn't really care so much about John Arthur Bowen anyways. Old Frank Key spent incredible amounts of time on the prosecution of Dr. Reuben Crandall. It was clear that Francis Scott Key, the district attorney of Washington, D.C., believed that Dr. Reuben Crandall was the real culprit in the Snow Riot debacle. John Arthur Bowen was a mere slave, but clearly Dr. Reuben Crandall's effort to stoke the slave's desire for freedom in America was the problem. Key declared as the trial began in 1837, in April 1837, was nothing less than a base and demoniacal effort to incite slaves, free Negroes, and others to stir up against slave owners. Dr. Reuben Crandall, in Francis Scott Key's view, was guilty of sedition and should pay a heavy price. The U.S. versus Dr. Reuben Crandall show trial lasted 10 days. One of President Andrew Jackson's motivations for appointing Francis Scott Key was so Francis Scott Key would put down the anti-slavery movement and to enforce the legality of slavery in the District of Columbia. Key secured an indictment for seditious libel after 3 constables who were slave catchers in their off hours found that Dr. Reuben Crandall had a trunk full of anti-slavery publications in his Georgetown residence. 5 days after the Snow Riot, which was caused by the rumors of a mentally ill slave had attempted to kill an elderly white woman. That was a John Arthur Bowen. So that was his crime. In a trunk in his home, Dr. Reuben Crandall had abolitionist papers. A piece of paper that had abolitionist words on it. Slave catchers are one of the origins of the police to make sure black slaves abided by the laws, to get them back onto the plantations and to know their place as being subordinate to their masters and to white people in general. The Fugitive Slave Act, signed by President George Washington, began in the very beginning of our nation. And so the officials, the authorities, would chase after black folks, beat them up, push them onto the plantation so they could get, violently oppressed there. It makes me think of, actually, child abusers. Child abusers will run to somebody's house, and that person will be a child abuser too, and that child abuser will push them back into the violent, oppressive hellhole from which they came. So, slave catchers was one of the origins. Another origin was that they had their origins as strike breakers, such as the Pinkertons, who slaughtered white folks because they wanted to unionize. Dr. Reuben Crandall had the abolitionist papers innocently, meaning he only possessed them. He didn't distribute them. He didn't write them. He made no money having them. All he did was possess them. He had them in the privacy of his own homes. This isn't even a freedom of speech case. This is a right to privacy case. And the warrant that was issued by the 3 constables was illegal. So Francis Scott Key is abusing his authority, so abuse of the public trust, breaking and entering, and malicious prosecution. One of the pamphlets found in Dr. Reuben Crandall's lockbox inside the privacy of his own home said this: "Our plan of emancipation is simply this: to promulgate the doctrine of human rights in high places and low places, and all places where there are human beings, to whisper it in chimney corners, and to proclaim it from the housetops, from the mountaintops, to pour it out like water from the pulpit and the press, to raise it up with all the force of the inner man from infancy to gray hairs, to give line upon line, precept upon precept, till it forms one of the foundation principles and parts indestructible of the public soul." That piece of paper with those words are what alarmed Francis Scott Key, the author of the Star-Spangled Banner, to push for the prosecution hard against Reuben Crandall. The U.S. versus Reuben Crandall show trial was the most sensational show trial in Washington, D.C. in years. The newspaper coverage was extensive. The courtroom in City Hall was crowded. Several congressmen took front row seats. Dr. Reuben Crandall was defended by 2 of Washington's most skillful attorneys, Richard Cox and Joseph Bradley. Joseph Bradley was handed the courtroom theatrics. He had responsibility for the courtroom theatrics. And there's this one moment where Joseph Bradley read aloud a statement on the evils of slavery. When the court demanded to know its relevance, Joseph Bradley revealed that the words, the evils of slavery words, had come from the mouth of Francis Scott Key himself years earlier. Though Crandall's offense was nothing more than possessing abolitionist literature, Francis Scott Key felt that the abolitionist free speech rights were so dangerous that he sought unsuccessfully to have Reuben Crandall hanged. He wanted to kill him. Francis Scott Key made national headlines by asking whether the property rights of slaveholders outweighed the free speech rights of those arguing for slavery's abolishment. But really, Francis Scott Key hoped to silence abolitionists who he charged wished to associate and amalgamate with the Negro. In the April 1837 trial that attracted nationwide attention, Francis Scott Key charged that Reuben Crandall's actions instigated slaves to rebel. Crandall's attorneys acknowledged that he opposed slavery, but denied any intent or actions to encourage rebellion. Francis Scott Key, the author of the Star-Spangled Banner, also known as the 1814 Defense of Fort McHenry poem that was sang to the tune of a British melody, in his final address to the jury that the U.S. v. Reuben Crandall was one of the most important cases ever tried in the nation's capital. The issue, he said, according to the trial transcript, was whether our institutions have any means of legal defense against a set of men of most horrid principles whose means of attack upon us are insurrection, tumult, and violence. Francis Scott Key appealed to the all-white jury's sense of supremacy. Francis Scott Key said, "Are you willing, gentlemen, to abandon your country to permit it to be taken from you and occupied by the abolitionists, according to whose taste it is to associate and amalgamate with the Negro? Or, gentlemen, on the other hand, are there laws in this community to defend you from the immediate abolitionists who would open upon you the floodgates of such extensive wickedness and mischief?" Joseph Brantley replied that Key's case was based on a tissue of supposition and that punishing Reuben Crandall for sedition would set a dangerous precedent that would endanger every American's constitutional rights. A jury deliberated for 1 to 3 hours, and ultimately they acquitted Reuben Crandall. They let him go free. But the sad truth is that Reuben Crandall, even though he was acquitted, he had already been condemned to die, if only inadvertently. During his incarceration in the squalid city jail, he had contracted tuberculosis. After his release, Reuben Crandall set sail for Kingston, Jamaica to recuperate, but it was no use. As he grew sicker, he welcomed God's grace. He never mentioned Key in the final fond letters to his family. He would die on January 17th, 1838, while he was in Jamaica. January 17th, 1838 was 11 days after Dr. Reuben Crandall turned 32 years old. So even though Francis Key didn't get convicted, didn't get Reuben Crandall convicted, and he didn't get Reuben Crandall executed by hanging like he wanted to, he was able to successfully impose a death sentence upon him over a bullshit show trial for having papers in the privacy of his own homes, in a trunk in the privacy of his own home. And that's the author of your beloved national anthem, America. That wasn't the only time Francis Scott Key pressed charges against publishers for their abolitionist literature. He did the same in 1833, several years prior to the U.S. versus Dr. Reuben Crandall trial. In 1833, Key secured a grand jury indictment against Benjamin Lundy, editor of the anti-slavery publication, The Genius of Universal Emancipation, and his printer, William Greer, for libel after Lundy published an article that declared there is neither mercy nor justice for colored people in this District of Columbia. Lundy's article, Key said in the indictment, was intended to injure, oppress, aggrieve, and vilify the good name, fame, credit, and reputation of the magistrates and constables of Washington, D.C., the good name of the constables, the slave catchers. Lundy left town rather than face trial, and Greer was acquitted. So even though Key wasn't able to win a conviction, he was able to get Benjamin Lundy to leave Washington, D.C. for good. And perhaps that was one of his motivations for Dr. Reuben Crandall to humiliate him, put him in jail for a year, make him seem like he's a bad guy. And even if he doesn't get the conviction, he'll leave. And he did leave. He left the earth permanently. Dr. Reuben Crandall. What good could Dr. Reuben Crandall have done? But instead, he's dead at 32 years of age. The Civil War is a 30-year conflict that had 5 years of armed conflict at the end of it. And Francis Scott Key started on the wrong side. He's the one that initiated the trials against these abolitionists. He was pro-slavery. He was in favor of decolonization to ship Africans back, black people back to Africa. So the 30-year conflict and having 5 years of violence at the end, he was on the wrong side. Old Frank Key was the one who had organized for the slave catchers to raid Dr. Reuben Crandall's house illegally with an illegal warrant. He abused his authority as a prosecutor, the chief prosecutor of Washington, D.C. And he was the one who pushed for Dr. Reuben Crandall's prosecution, including pushing to have Dr. Reuben Crandall's body to be swinging from the gallows for some pamphlets that Dr. Reuben Crandall had in one of his personal lock boxes in his trunk in the privacy of his own home. Old Frank Key wanted to lynch Dr. Reuben Crandall for his anti-slavery abolitionist views. The division between the pro- and anti-slavery forces crystallized in these years, and it emerges in Congress really in 1835, right after the riot. And if you look at our electoral map today, those divisions correspond roughly to the divisions between our red states and the blue states. Colson Whitehead wrote a book called Underground Railroad, and in this book, Colson Whitehead said this: "And America, too, is a delusion, the grandest one of all," says a character in the book near the end. The white race believes with all its heart that it is their right to take the land, to kill Indians, make war, enslave their brothers. This nation shouldn't exist if there is any justice in the world, for its foundations are murder, theft, and cruelty. Yet, here we are. Thank you for watching.